start with a little funny story, and I just thought of an old classic that I liked a lot. You might have heard it before. It's about the local painter. He paints houses and civic buildings and churches and things like that. So there was a contract out from one of the big churches in town to paint the outside of it, and he got the contract. But he always got the contracts because his secret was he thinned his paint down. So it went farther, so he could do a much lower estimate. So he got the job, he's working on this big church, painting it on, he's nearly done on the scaffolding out there, he's nearly done. And all of a sudden, a huge storm comes up, and the rain is pouring down, and it like washes that paint right off the church, and it knocks him off his scaffolding, and he's down on the ground among the gravestones of the cemetery that surrounds the church, and he knows it's a judgment from above. And he says, "Forgive me, God, forgive me. What can I do to make amends?" And this voice comes down from above, and it says, "Repaint and thin no more." That's a good one. That's a good story. Repaint. Well, fitting to start with a good story. That's my title today, a good story. And I've been doing some reflections on stories, and we live by stories. I've always been a great lover of stories. As most of you know, I was an English major my whole life. All the way through school and college and grad school and all that. And I really grew up loving stories. Writing stories, reading stories. Do any of you remember in grade school you'd get those little newspaper sheets and you'd pick out your books you wanted? And then they'd be delivered to you at the school. And, such excitement. Okay, do they still do that? Oh, I'm so glad to hear they still do that. Because that was early excitement about, I'm getting new books. And it was so exciting, and I'm glad to know that's still going on. Our love of stories is so basic to us, so innate to us. And yet there's still a lot of mystery around stories, a lot of things we're not conscious about stories and the power of them, the influence of them on us, on each other, on our world. Stories are very important, they're very powerful. A writer by the name of Sam Keen says we are narrative animals. We are narrative animals. We live by stories. We identify ourselves by stories. And our spiritual way-showers, our great spiritual teachers, have always shared their most powerful teachings through stories. Jesus' wonderful use of parables all through the New Testament, that's how he taught. Jesus was not a lecturer. Jesus was a storyteller. He told stories, and the ideas and the images in those stories would stick with people, and they would reflect on them and think, what does that mean to me? All stories have tremendous influence. All the stories we tell ourselves or are told about us, or that we tell about each other, they have a lot of influence. So it's really important that we tell good stories and not bad ones, because both have a lot of influence. They reflect who we are, our stories. The great writer Anais Nin, she said, we don't tell stories as they are, we tell stories as we are. That explains a lot, I think. I'm sure like me, many of you have wondered why two people who came through the same experience can tell a completely different story about it. Completely different story about it. Like eyewitness accounts of accidents or things like that, they're notoriously unreliable. Everybody sees them differently and tells a different story about them. People growing up in the same family tell a different story about where they came from and what that family was like. Have you all had that experience as I have? It's kind of mysterious, isn't it? Same parents, same dynamics, seemingly, same house, same community, totally different story about it. So what's the true story? The true story is who we are and how we see it. They reveal us. There's a wonderful spiritual way-shower from Ireland I've just kind of become acquainted with lately. His name is Padraig O'Tama. He says, stories tell us. Stories tell us. We don't tell stories, stories tell us. And that helps explain a lot, explains that mystery a lot. And he talks a lot about the danger of bad stories, that we really have to be careful about passing on bad stories or telling bad stories about ourselves or others. He refers to those kinds of stories as a damp blanket, the damp blanket of bad stories that kind of come down and suffocate. And that really kind of sticks with me, that idea. Bad stories are kind of deadening. They block us, they limit, they create limitations, they shut off inquiry or curiosity. They shut down communications, shut us down to ourselves and to each other. He gave an example from his work. He serves as a minister or a chaplain at a center in Ireland, Northern Ireland, called Corrymeela. I don't know whether any of you might have heard of it. It was very instrumental in helping to resolve what they called the Troubles in Ireland between Catholics and Protestants that went on for years. How many of you grew up on news coming out of them of car bombings and shootings? And they finally found their way toward a reconciliation. And Corrymeela is a place where they did a lot of conversation, a lot of dialogue, a lot of work on that. Padraig Otama calls it a soft place for hard conversations, which is a phrase I like. But he's done over the years a lot of work on trying to resolve those divides, and so much of it involved bad stories carried on, shared and believed, that shut down communication. He gave an example of he was giving a talk somewhere, and the Troubles were still going on at that time, and doing a talk about reconciliation and so on, and a little girl came up afterwards, a little Catholic girl, and very young, and she asked him, why did God create Protestants? And Padraig said, well, why are you asking? Why do you wonder why God made Protestants? And the little girl said, because the Protestants hate God and they hate us. That's a dead story. That's a damp blanket story that was passed down, was passed to her, passed along to her, and was grabbed onto and believed. And it shuts down communications. It's a barrier to further inquiry or curiosity or communication. And I think we've all had some experience of damp blanket stories, haven't we? Damp blanket stories, ones that, they're often ones kind of passed down about ourselves sometimes, before we have the consciousness to be able to say, that's not true about me, that's not who I am. These damp blanket stories can be very damaging, very wounding, and when we believe them about each other, also very, very damaging. Shutting us down, a bad story is deadening, and so that's something to kind of think about. There's often an unconscious quality about them. They're often passed along. They could be about us, they could be about others, they could be about our world, they could be about God, they could be about anything. But if it's like kind of puts a damp blanket on things and shuts down, like that's the end of the matter, you're probably looking at a bad story. And it's a good idea to take a closer look at it and do some questioning about it. What makes for a good story? A good story is enlivening. It's the opposite of that. A good story is enlivening. It opens us up to more life, more questions, more curiosity, more imagination. Padraig, this Irish guy from Corrymeela, he says in the Irish language they have a phrase, and I can't speak Irish, it's a very difficult language to even kind of capture a word, but he says it's to put value and respect on a story. You don't just rattle off a story, you put value on it. You put respect and substance on it. And he says it takes a muscular engagement with the story to do that properly. A muscular engagement with the story. And I think that's a nice way of talking about a really good story, a story that has life in it. It kind of brings us alive a little bit. Widens the possibilities for us, brings us new ideas. It's the opposite of a damp blanket story. It opens up new ideas in our minds and opens up communications and a sense of connectedness with life. They give us a wider understanding of who we are. And it can happen in all kinds of different ways. I remember as a kid, I was really blessed. I had a wonderful teacher in 3rd grade who let me read my stories for the class, because I was writing stories a lot, crazy little stories. I still remember some of them. One was about Patty the Flying Lion. Where do these things things come from. And she would applaud each one and say, oh, you must read that for the class. And I remember distinctly one day she was telling another teacher in the hallway in my presence about my wonderful story writing, and she said, Joanne is going to be an author. And it was a very, what a strong story to tell about someone in my hearing. That's an empowering, wide open, and new possibilities I've never considered before, didn't even really know that word very well. And she was telling similar stories about other third graders in the class, that someone could paint, she's an artist, she's going to be an artist. Or someone else can sing, she's going to be a famous singer or whatever. She empowered her class in that way by telling good stories about them, that we take in stories like that. That's what a good story will do. It brings us to life. It's enlivening. It opens up new possibilities for us. It opens up imagination. When I was doing a lot of volunteer work in hospice, I heard so many enlivening stories from people, widening the possibilities of life, of the universe. I'm remembering, for instance, and I may have shared this story once before, I had a patient named Vera, a hospice client named Vera. She was about 80, and in hospice she had lung cancer. Lived down in German Village. And I would go down and give her rides to the store, rides to here, rides to there. I was her driver. And she would share things with me, and we just sort of became friends in those last weeks of her life, month or two perhaps. I knew her, but she told me a story one day, for instance, and I heard a lot of stories like this, but I had gone down to see her, and she said she'd had kind of a little bit of a challenging week, that she'd had a doctor appointment, and it had become very clear to her that her time was very limited, and she was going soon. And death became very real to her. She got home from that appointment and sat down in her easy chair, and she just felt so much fear. And she said it was in the midst of that, all of a sudden she felt a hand on her shoulder, a steadying hand. And it was so real, she turned around, and there was nobody there. And it brought her great comfort, and that fear eased, and it didn't come back after that. It brought her to a kind of peace. Now that's a story that's widening. Was it an angel? Unseen guides in our midst, closer than we realize. She didn't know, I don't know either. But that's a story that she shared with me, and it was a gift of a story. Because it widened up the possibilities. There's so much more to life than we realize. There's so much more to love than we realize. Angels in our midst. Yeah, I'm open to that. I'm open to all those possibilities. Good stories do that for us. They open us up to new possibilities, new ideas as we reflect on them. Third thing about good stories is that they connect us. They help us realize our connection with one another, that we are really all connected. I taught ESL, for English as a second language, for a number of years too, and Japanese students, Arabic students, African, Russian, all over the place. I taught at Columbus State for a while and other places. But invariably you would find we would talk about food a lot to get started. Everybody loves food. Favorite dishes, and then you talk about holidays and how you celebrate those. You talk about family. People would share stories about how they celebrated things. And in no time at all you realize, we're really all the same. A little bit of a difference in language, but we're the same. We're connected. Storytelling connects us in that way. And I think of people who do recovery work. AA meetings are all about stories, all about storytelling. People who get up and do those lead talks, those lead stories, they're telling difficult stories of where they were in the grip of addiction, how bad it got, what the bottom of that was like, what turned it around, how they got out of that place, how they came into greater life and health and sobriety and steadiness of purpose. And those are difficult stories to tell. But as they do that in a community that's accepting and non-judging, everyone feels their connection. We're in this together. We're supporting each other. we realize our oneness. Those are muscular stories to tell. Those take that kind of energy to really put respect on that story. These stories are a part of our lives, and it seems to me here's the fourth and I think ultimate teaching about good stories. The best stories come from love. All the best stories come from love. And if I think back on the stories in my life, all the best, most empowering, most influential stories came from love. All those AA stories, why do people tell them? To help others. To help others. They come from love. Why did Mrs. Marshall tell all those wonderful stories about her third graders? All came from love. She wanted to love and empower and guide and inspire those children. What was behind Vera telling me about the hand on her shoulder? It was her wanting to share this experience of love she had and wanting to share that with someone else, to feel some of that same inspiration, that same love. I think that was behind all of Jesus' stories. All about love, all about realizing more deeply the power of love in us, in our midst, and the power of the God that loves us, that was a God of love, that he was teaching all the time, and how to live in that kingdom, that domain of knowing your oneness with God and you're loved by God. And it was very different from how most of those listening to him were taught about God. They were taught about a judgmental God, a condemning God, a God judging you, watching you all the time. We got some of that in our culture, wouldn't you agree? Anyone grow up on some of that notion about God? That is not what Jesus taught in his stories. His stories were all about love, and it's unconditional, non-judgmental, with us always, don't have to deserve it, don't have to earn it, for every one of us without exception. Empowering, life-bringing, universe-widening stories. I was thinking, for instance, probably my all-time favorite story, Jesus' story, is the one of the prodigal son. Very, very familiar story. It's a story about love. He was really trying to make really powerful this idea that our God is a God of love, completely without judgment or condemnation, always ready to receive us joyfully. And that's the story he told. And I'm sure most of you remember it, but it's a very familiar story even now, thousands of years later, about a young man. He's got an older brother. They work on the father must be fairly wealthy, and it's a farm, work very hard. It's probably a life of a lot of hard work, a lot of drudgery, working on the farm. And he's a young man with a kind of restless energy, and he wants to go out and he wants to live his life. He wants to do what he wants to do. So he asked his father for part of his inheritance now, instead of waiting until much later. Can I have it now and go and live my life, the way I want to? And the father says yes. Jesus is teaching, God always says yes to us. God always says yes. So he takes his inheritance and he goes off to live the life he wants, and all we know is that he squandered it. He lost it all. The translation I remember is he lost it all on profligate living. I didn't know what that meant, really. Profligate. It doesn't sound good. So we don't know exactly what he did. Maybe there was a lot of drunkenness and drugs, maybe. I think there have always been drugs. It could have been that. A lot of buying of unnecessary stuff. We don't know what all he did in that profligate living stage. All we know is that he ran through all his resources and was destitute and desperate. And then we're told he came to himself. He remembered he had a home, he had a father. He came to himself. He was like trying to survive by eating pig fodder. When he came to himself and realized, I can go home, and I can maybe make amends and be willing to change, and I can go back. And the story goes that as he's almost still a ways off, the father sees him, runs to greet him in great excitement and joy, and welcomes him home, and they order up a feast and celebrate because the son he'd lost was found and was back home. And his listeners must have thought, what is that about? This is supposed to be about God welcoming us always, even when we've made big messes and mistakes in our lives. What kind of God is this? This was a widening, enlivening idea for his listeners. That this is the kind of God Jesus was teaching them about. A God that's always there for us, that doesn't want to judge or condemn us, Doesn't matter what we've done. You don't have to earn it, deserve it, anything like that. It's there for you. Just kind of come to yourself, realize, I'm a child of the living God. I can go home right now. What a powerful story that was. I bet people listen to that story in awe and wonder and continued to think about it. It opened up inquiry, imagination, expanding the influence of love in us, in our midst. That loving God that is with us always unfailingly. These are good stories. These are the stories we need to tell ourselves and share with each other. Those are stories that live on and they get told and retold. Stories that empower, stories about God's loving influence in our midst, the love that's with us always. We need to tell only good stories about ourselves, about each other, about God. So here's my affirmation I'm using this week, if you'd like to join me in it. I tell good stories that spread rich blessings. Want to join me in that? I tell good stories that spread rich blessings. Let's take that into prayer for a moment and affirm that within, that intention, that powerful purpose. All the stories I tell are good. All the stories we share with one another are good and will be empowering and widening and enlivening. We'll create new questions and imaginings, new possibilities in our lives and in the lives of others. I tell only good stories, and I am blessed. And so it is. Amen.